The Varieties of Religious Experience. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. Lecture 4. The Religion of Healthy-mindedness. If we were to ask the question, what is human life's chief concern? One of the answers we should receive would be, it is happiness. How to gain, how to keep, how to recover happiness is in fact for most men at all times the secret motive of all they do, and of all they are willing to endure. The hedonistic school in ethics deduces the moral life wholly from the experiences of happiness and unhappiness, which different kinds of conduct bring. And even more in the religious life than in the moral life, happiness and unhappiness seem to be the poles around which the interest revolves. We need not go so far as to say with the author whom I lately quoted, that any persistent enthusiasm is, as such, religion, nor need we call mere laughter a religious exercise. But we must admit that any persistent enjoyment may produce the sort of religion which consists in a grateful admiration of the gift of so happy an existence. And we must also acknowledge that the more complex ways of experiencing religion are new manners of producing happiness, wonderful inner paths to a supernatural kind of happiness when the first gift of natural existence is unhappy, as it so often proves itself to be. With such relations between religion and happiness, it is perhaps not surprising that men come to regard the happiness which a religious belief affords as a proof of its truth. If a creed makes a man feel happy, he almost inevitably adopts it. Such a belief ought to be true, therefore it is true. Such, rightly or wrongly, is one of the immediate inferences of the religious logic used by ordinary men. The near presence of God's Spirit, says a German writer, quote, may be experienced in its reality, indeed only experienced, and the mark by which the Spirit's existence and nearness are made irrefutably clear to those who have ever had the experience is the utterly incomparable feeling of happiness, which is connected with the nearness, and which is therefore not only a possible and altogether proper feeling for us to have here below, but is the best and most indispensable proof of God's reality. No other proof is equally convincing, and therefore happiness is the point from which every efficacious new theology should start. Close quote. In the hour immediately before us, I shall invite you to consider the simpler kinds of religious happiness, leaving the more complex sorts to be treated on a later day. In many persons, happiness is congenital and irreclaimable. Cosmic emotion inevitably takes in them the form of enthusiasm and freedom. I speak not only of those who are amiably happy. I mean those who, when unhappiness is offered or proposed to them, positively refuse to feel it, as if it were something mean and wrong. We find such persons in every age, passionately flinging themselves upon their sense of the goodness of life, in spite of the hardships of their own condition, and in spite of the sinister theologies into which they may be born. From the outset, their religion is one of union with the divine. The heretics who went before the Reformation are lavishly accused by the church writers of antinomian practices, just as the first Christians were accused of indulgence in orgies by the Romans. It is probable that there never has been a century in which the deliberate refusal to think ill of life has not been idealized by a sufficient number of persons to form sects, open or secret, who claimed all natural things to be permitted. St. Augustine's maxim, dilige et quod vis fac, if you love but God, you may do as you incline, is morally one of the profoundest of observations, yet it is pregnant for such persons, with passports beyond the bounds of conventional morality. According to their characters, they have been refined or gross, but their belief has been at all times systematic enough to constitute a definite religious attitude. God was for them a giver of freedom, and the sting of evil was overcome. St. Francis and his immediate disciples were, on the whole, of this company of spirits, of which there are of course infinite varieties. Rousseau, in the earlier years of his writing, Diderot, B. de Saint-Pierre, and many of the leaders of the 18th century anti-Christian movement were of this optimistic type. They owed their influence to a certain authoritativeness in their feeling that nature, if you will only trust her sufficiently, is absolutely good. It is to be hoped that we all have some friend, perhaps more often feminine than masculine, and young than old, whose soul is of this sky blue tint, whose affinities are rather with flowers and birds and all enchanting innocencies than with dark human passions, who can think no ill of man or God, and in whom religious gladness, being in possession from the outset, needs no deliverance from any antecedent burden. God has two families of children on this earth, says Francis W. Newman, the once-born and the twice-born. And the once-born he describes as follows, quote, "They see God not as a strict judge, not as a glorious potentate, but as the animating spirit of a beautiful, harmonious world, beneficent and kind, merciful as well as pure. The same characters generally have no metaphysical tendencies. They do not look back into themselves. Hence, they are not distressed by their own imperfections. Yet it would be absurd to call them self-righteous, for they hardly think of themselves at all. This childlike quality of their nature makes the opening of religion very happy to them, for they no more shrink from God than a child from an emperor, before whom the parent trembles. In fact, they have no vivid conception of any of the qualities in which the severer majesty of God consists." Footnote: I once heard a lady describe the pleasure it gave her to think that she could always cuddle up to God. End footnote. He is to them the impersonation of kindness and beauty. They read his character not in the disordered world of man, but in romantic and harmonious nature. Of human sin they know perhaps little in their own hearts, and not very much in the world, and human suffering does but melt them to tenderness. Thus, when they approach God, no inward disturbance ensues, and without being as yet spiritual, they have a certain complacency, and perhaps romantic sense of excitement in their simple worship. Close quote. In the Romish Church, such characters find a more congenial soil to grow in than in Protestantism, whose fashions of feeling have been set by minds of a decidedly pessimistic order. But even in Protestantism they have been abundant enough, and in its recent liberal developments of Unitarianism and Latitudinarianism, generally, minds of this order have played and still are playing leading and constructive parts. Emerson himself is an admirable example. Theodore Parker is another. Here are a couple of characteristic passages from Parker's correspondence. Quote, "Orthodox scholars say, 'In the heathen classics you find no consciousness of sin.' It is very true, God be thanked for it. They were conscious of wrath, of cruelty, avarice, drunkenness, lust, sloth, cowardice, and other actual vices, and struggled and got rid of the deformities. But they were not conscious of enmity against God, and didn't sit down and whine and groan against non-existent evil. I have done